In this video, we're going to outline the 5 key studies that you need to know for consumer specialized options for A-level. The first study I'm going to talk about is by North, and it's about how music affects customer spending at restaurants. Now, this is a field experiment, and we use the same restaurant for the entire experiment. We have 2 CDs that were created that are 72 minutes long. One CD is classical music and the other is pop music. And these are your independent variables. Your dependent variable is going to be how much money that was spent by customers or the revenue of the restaurant during those periods of time. Overall, there were 393 customers, which are our participants. Now, the sales were measured over 1 week periods of time. So it was 1 week of pop music, we measured the revenue. 1 week of classical music, we measured the revenue. And our results showed a significant difference of spending between pop and classical music. Classical music had the highest amount of spending, and that was compared to pop and compared to no music at all. The next study is by Robson et al., and this is consumer responses to table spacing in restaurants. So our participants weren't actually in a restaurant this time, but we used questionnaires and diagrams to give our participants regarding eating in restaurants and table spacing. Basically, the tables that we showed them were spaced 6 inches, 12 inches, and 24 inches apart, and those are your independent variables. We also gave them scenarios to think about while in those specific independent variables. And those scenarios are like subcategories of your independent variable. And those topics were business, friend, and romantic. The sample was just over 1,000 people, and the results showed that participants were strongly negative about tightly spaced tables of 6 inches apart. If the tables were 6 inches apart, they generally felt very negative about the restaurant. 70% of our participants said they would have asked to be reseated. The 12 inches apart was also less desirable, especially if you were on like a romantic date. And this is important for businesses to know because they don't technically want their diners to leave early. They want them to stay and spend the most amount of money. So maybe you'll notice the spacing of tables the next time you go to a restaurant. Is it between 12 and 24 inches? Because that is shown to be the most comfortable. The next study is by Hall, and we are talking about choice blindness for the taste of jam and the smell of tea. And choice blindness is basically when someone doesn't know the difference between the choice they made and what they were given. A tasting venue was set up at a supermarket in Sweden. There were 118 females and 62 males. Participants were asked to taste jam and smell teas and basically just tell them which pairing they preferred. And half of the participants were told that they would receive the product at the end, and this was done just to assure that they would want to take this home. So participants tasted and smelled the products, then they were asked to go and rate the product and then smell or taste it again just to make sure. But when they went to rate the product, some of the products were switched for other products. Whether it was switched or not for participants, they were asked to taste it again and rate it again. At the end of the experiment, participants were debriefed, and we asked participants if they suspected any manipulation of the product. The results showed 14.4% of the jam tasters and 13.8% of the tea smellers reported that they suspected something suspicious immediately after tasting or smelling the product. But overall, because there were different levels of like suspecting it immediately, suspecting it later on, overall, 33.3% of the jam tasters and 32% of the tea smellers, manipulated trials only, detected that the product was switched. So this means that no more than 1/3 of the manipulated trials were detected. And this basically proves that choice blindness exists because 2/3 of the participants who had the product switched didn't know, didn't suspect. This next study is by Becker, and it has to do with like food quality and preference, more specifically like the packaging of food and the way that it tastes. So the aim was to look at the way that a product was packaged, like the shape and the color, and figure out what the perception of the participant would be. Here's an example. Now quickly, there were 3 hypotheses. Basically, an angular package would create a more intense flavor for the customer. A highly saturated color on the product would create a high intensity flavor for the customer. Then in the third one, they kind of combined it to saying that if it was more congruent, so something that was more angular and more saturated in color was going to be better than something that was round and less saturated in color. But there's a fourth hypothesis too. The fourth one basically says the predicted effects will be greater for those who actually care about the way the product looks versus those who don't. So each participant was shown a 3D clip for 20 seconds of the product on a laptop. There were about 151 participants, equal men and women, and this was done in a German supermarket. So the results showed that the color, the angular color, and the shape of the product, people are going to expect to pay more money for that. Most of all, the angular shaped product, people will expect to have a more intense flavor experience. So in the results, we see that those who have a high sensitivity to design, that is where the design, the shape, the color really came into play, because for those who really didn't care, it didn't matter. For the angular versus round products, the angular products, people expected to pay more for those than the rounded products. But those that had a low saturated color compared to a high saturated color, the low saturated color, people expected to pay more for those. And that last result, that goes against what people normally thought, because people tend to use a high saturation in color to like draw your eye to the product. But now they know that even if they draw your eye to the product, you expect to pay less for something like that. Now, remember, this was done on a laptop, so where something is placed on a shelf could also have something to do with, how much you expect to pay for it and how flavorful you think it'll be. But there definitely needs to be more or further investigation into this, because the results were kind of all over the place. If the color was high, we expected it to be more potent in flavor, but we wanted to pay less for it. And the last study is by Snyder and DeBono. And this is about understanding the psychology of advertising. Key words here are high and low self-monitoring. A high self-monitoring person might adjust their behavior from setting to social setting. A low self-monitoring person, they may kind of stay the same, have the same behavior in any and all types of settings. So we have 3 studies here. High versus low self-monitors in study 1. Are they going to respond differently to products that focus on image versus quality? Study 2 is the same idea as study 1, except we're introducing whether people will pay more for the product. And study 3 goes a little bit further and says, never mind buy it, but would the participant consume the product? First, participants were giving self-monitoring scales so that we can create 2 groups of people. In the first experiment, we have a magazine that has 3 different products: whiskey, cigarettes, and coffee. And there were 2 advertisements for each. In one advertisement, we focused on the slogan, and the other, we focused on the quality of the picture. In study 2, the same 6 advertisements were used, except this time we split the all slogans to one half of the group and the all images to the other half of the group. And we said, how much would you be willing to pay for this? So where experiment 1 or study 1 may have been a repeated measures, experiment 2, study 2 was independent groups. Study 3 was about shampoo. Same participants, except we delivered 2 messages about the shampoo. 1, how it cleans your hair. 2, how it makes your hair look. Here are the results. In study 1, people who are considered high self-monitors cared more about how the image looked, and low self-monitors more about the quality of the product. In study 2, the high self-monitors would pay more for the product if we focused more on the image. Low self-monitors would pay more if we focused on the quality. And for study 3, the high self-monitors were more likely to use the product if it left their hair looking bold and beautiful. And low self-monitors were more willing to use the product if it left their hair looking clean. I hope this video helps you. Thanks so much for being here. Good luck on those exams.